Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 464. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anslone. A lot of news to talk about on today's show. First, I want to remind people that we are hosted at the Libertarian Institute. And so if you head on over to the Libertarian Institute, you can find all the work I do, news articles, featured articles, this show, the daily news roundup. I do a ton of work at the Libertarian Institute and put out a lot of content. If you'd like to support the Institute, of course, that is the organization founded by the great Scott Horton, Sheldon Richmond, and now includes myself, Keith Knight, Patrick McFarlane, Connor Freeman, Will Porter, and a bunch of other great writers and podcasters like Tommy Solomons, James Bolivar, Lori Calhoun, Ted Galen Carpenter, and Ted Snyder. So please head on over to the Libertarian Institute, check us out, and make a donation if you can. We got some great kit bats if you could donate. And with that, I will get into today's episode. Now, there's quite a bit to talk about in today's show, but I just want to take a minute here, and I think it's worth it to talk about the Republicans and their policy on Mexico because, for basically my entire lifetime, the idea that the U.S. would wage a war on this continent was kind of absurd. Particularly Mexico and Canada are near neighbors. Like Cuba or something like that, maybe. But, the idea that we would go war with our major neighbors, Cuba or Canada, just seemed absolutely ridiculous. But now it seems to be moving into the consensus position among Republican presidential candidates. And so Dave DeCamp has this great article from last week. DeSantis pledges to send military into Mexico to fight cartels on day one. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said on Wednesday night that he would send the military into Mexico to fight the drug cartels on day one of his presidency if he wins the 2024 election. At the Republican presidential debate in Milwaukee, DeSantis was asked if he would send U.S. Special Forces to take out fentanyl labs and other cartel operations. He said, yes, and I will do it on day one. We have a response. We have to reestablish the rule of law, and we have to defend our people. The President of the United States has to use all available powers as Commander-in-Chief to protect our country. DeSantis claimed that cartels are killing tens of thousands of our fellow citizens and would treat them as a foreign terrorist organization. Taking military action across the border would dramatically expand the decades-old failed war on drugs, but the idea of invading or bombing Mexico in response to a large number of overdoses in the U.S. is becoming increasingly popular among Republicans. Other 2024 hopefuls have called for military action against cartels, including the frontrunner President Donald Trump. And so, of course, the idea that you would just go in and take out a couple fentanyl labs is absolutely ridiculous. The U.S. military isn't able to do that. They fought a 20-year drug war in Afghanistan and only created more and more drugs. It wasn't until after the U.S. left and the Taliban took back over did the opium and poppy production there finally get reined in and under control. And so sending the U.S. military to Afghanistan, why would that do anything? Or not Afghanistan, Mexico. Why would that do anything other than lead to innocent Mexicans being killed? Additionally, if this is done without the cooperation of the Mexican government, that means that the Mexican government would likely view this as an invasion because we are sending our military over a border where they are not wanted to fight a war. This is lunacy. This is the worst policy that you could possibly have, to go to war with one of your direct neighbors. I mean, it's stupid to provoke a war and a potential nuclear war halfway across the world in Taiwan or Ukraine. Absolutely. But actually going to war with a neighboring country is going to be disastrous. Further, this initially will be, a couple surgical operations just to take out a couple fentanyl labs and cartel leaders, which of course are artificially propped up likely by the CIA, but definitely only have power because of the massive U.S. war on drugs and, just the causes of the black market and prohibition for so long, and especially cocaine. Rich Americans, they love cocaine so much, and yet in Washington, I'm sure nearly everybody in government is doing blow or has done it at some time in their life, but then they outlaw it. And so what that does is it basically they're insulated. Nobody in Washington, as we see from the president's son, goes to jail for doing coke, even crack, right? He's white, so you get away with it. And so we have these people who are isolated from the effects of their prohibition because they can't be arrested, they can't get in trouble for doing the drugs, and yet they import massive amounts of it. And then they tell all these other countries, from Peru all the way to Mexico, that they have no choice but to make it illegal. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of internal reasons why all these countries, make these drugs illegal as well. But, the U.S. mates them and gives them money to enforce the war on drugs. And so not only are they sending, billions of dollars through the black market economy that goes back to the cartels, but they're also trying to pressure those governments to take out the cartels. And what this does is it basically destroys all these countries because the cartels have so much money, they just buy up the governments, and it works very well for them because it keeps their racket, their cartel in place, right? Because it is illegal, it's very hard for competition to move in. There's no legal competition that could be formed. None of this money can be banked. It can't. No disputes can be settled within the justice system. Everything has to occur in the black market, and so it absolutely wrecks so many of these, particularly very small countries in Central America with not very large economies. The drug market plays an absolutely massive role in that. And again, it's all based on policies and cocaine habits among the American elite, but particularly in Washington. And it's so frustrating to see it. Not that maybe DeSantis personally is a major user of cocaine or anything like that. He seems a little bit more evangelical among his conservative beliefs to be that way, but I could be wrong on that. So I just want to wrap up with Dave Camp's article here, because he mentions earlier this year Senator Lindsey Graham and John Kennedy, the Republicans from South Carolina and Louisiana, introduced a bill to designate cartels as a foreign terrorist organization, which has a total of 6 co-sponsors now. Graham said the purpose of the legislation was to set the stage for military intervention into Mexico. And so this is something that we really had to worry about getting passed, because if it gets passed now, Republican takes over in 2024, very possible we could be in war with Mexico. And then there is a bill in the House that was introduced by Representative Dan Crenshaw, Eye Patch McCain from Texas, that would authorize the president to use military force against, and this is the quote from the legislation, those responsible for trafficking fentanyl or fentanyl-related substances into the United States or carrying out other related activities that cause regional destabilization in the Western Hemisphere. And Crenshaw's bill has 21 co-sponsors. I guess one last thing to add here, and that is the Republicans make a huge deal out of fentanyl, which, I haven't done like a whole lot of research into fentanyl in particular, but there's very good libertarian theory on the war on drugs, on prohibition, and how it creates bigger problems. And one of the problems of the war on drugs is it takes drugs that are, more natural, and it incentivizes everyone to make them stronger. And so with heroin, right, strong drug, I'm not saying like, heroin's like a natural or fine thing or anything like that. However, that opiate high, well, now you have fentanyl coming in, right? And it's because it's so much more powerful and concentrated that I'm sure it's a lot easier to smuggle and purchase and to have on you, because you don't need quite so much. And so, this is something, again, that libertarian theory says happens. If you outlaw drugs, then more alternatives that are more concentrated, more potent, more lethal are going to find their way onto the market because there's going to be an increased demand for them. People are willing to take the increased risk to their health, taking the drugs because the risk of getting caught, with them or buying them gets so much more complicated. All right, so let's move on here. Talk about the war in Ukraine. This from Dave DeCamp. This is he writes up here a shocking article from David Ignatius at the Washington Post. And so in that article, Ignatius writes that most senior U.S. officials want to keep supporting the proxy war against Russia and are not looking for a diplomatic off-ramp despite Ukraine's faltering counteroffensive. And this is shocking, right? Because we've seen this going so poorly, and we've had American officials, while off the record, admitting that this counteroffensive is going very poorly. And you would just imagine that if there was any diversity of thought in Washington, if there was any concern about the Ukrainian people, if there was, any real desire to evaluate policy to make sure that the courses of action taking place are the best and most responsible, then you would think if you have a failing policy, something that isn't going as planned, there would be multiple people wanting to review that policy, maybe some major officials in the cabinet looking to go a different direction. But that isn't the case. This is, as always, double down, double down, double down. If something isn't working, it's because we didn't try hard enough. We didn't spend enough. Or in this case, the Ukrainians didn't send enough of their men to the front lines to be killed by the Russians and just chewed up by Russian minefields. That's, that is essentially what they're saying here, is that we just haven't done enough yet. And so their plan is to double down. And so this is concerning. Now, I have a little bit more insight on this. The Wall Street Journal reported on Thursday that the U.S. and Ukrainian officials have clashed over strategy for Ukraine's counteroffensive during behind-the-scenes conversations in recent weeks. The U.S. has been pushing Ukraine to use, quote, combined arm tactics that Ukrainian forces learned from NATO during the training in Europe ahead of the counteroffensive. The U.S. also wants Ukraine to concentrate its forces to make a big enough push towards the Sea of Azov to sever Russia's land bridge to Crimea. And the combined, and so, it's interesting that there's a split on this, because from some perspective, we have heard the Ukrainians, or at least reports that the Ukrainians were kind of agreeing with the U.S. in recent weeks, but this seems to suggest that, as the Ukrainian commander-in-chief says, that these splits are a little bit more substantial. He said, "You don't understand the nature of conflict. This is not counterinsurgency." Then he said, "This is Kursk, and this is referring to a major battle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union during World War II. So I guess he's kind of saying that, look, you guys have been fighting these low-scale counterinsurgencies in the Middle East for the past 20 years. You don't understand what this kind of warfare is like." And what the U.S. wants Ukraine to do, again, is to mass all of his forces in one smaller area. I'm guessing it doesn't mean like every single man is going to attack the same part in the Russian front lines, but, across probably a dozen or so miles, they're going to attack with a lot of troops at various points, and they're going to try to push the Russians back that way. And they want the Ukrainians to use combined armed tactics. Now, the problem with this is the West hasn't provided Ukraine with combined arms. This is supposed to have like air superiority and a good amount of artillery, and the Ukrainians lack all, I think, essentially conventional artillery at this point. Now, I'm sure they do still have some 155 millimeter conventional shells, but at one point during this war, they're firing thousands of these things every day. Earlier in this counteroffensive, I saw numbers from 3,000 to 8,000 of those rounds a day. And now they have to rely on the cluster munitions, the cluster artillery rounds instead. And I'm guessing that very much complicates trying to take territory if you're worrying about stepping on your own bomblets. And so we have this going on. We have these clashes. We have the West trying to push Ukraine to carry out an offensive that probably isn't going to work. And as I talked about on this show last week, I talked about it on the Misty Winston show and on the Scott Horton show last week. I was on Scott's KPFK, the LA radio show. And of course, Misty is on TNT radio at 6 o'clock now. 6 p.m. Eastern time. So if anybody wants, I recommend listening to those two shows, of course. I'll be back on Misty's show in about a week here. Not sure when I'll be back on Scott's show. I've been on the KPFK show about once a month. So, but anyways, the point I was making during those appearances was basically that I think this has a lot to do with politics in the U.S., that American officials are worried that without battlefield successes, that doesn't mean like sustainable successes, I don't think. It basically means being able to take the color on the map and change it from blue to red or whatever color you're using versus whatever color you want to use now. And I think that's really what the U.S. is looking for, is some battlefield successes. That way they could tell the Americans, hey, look, Ukraine's retaking territory again. Now we need to give them more weapons. Because the American people are turning against that. All right, so the Pentagon is going to start training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s in the U.S. The Pentagon will begin training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s inside the U.S. and could start as early as September, U.S. officials told the New York Times on Thursday. The U.S. initially said that training would only be conducted in Europe unless the countries leading it, the Netherlands and Denmark, reach capacity. We're open to training existing pilots if capacity is reached in Europe. That is what Sabrina Singh said on Monday. That's the condition. So Denmark and the Netherlands are taking the lead on training. If they just do not have the capacity to train as many pilots as Ukraine wants to send or plans to send, then we will help. We will train the stateside. So this is interesting. My understanding is the first round of training is only going to include 6 pilots with 2 in reserve. That doesn't seem like it should be capacity. But at the same time, the F-16s at some point, maybe there's a real choke point on the training capacity where, let's say because of the number of flight simulators or something like that, they only have 1 or 2 in Europe. And so for that reason, they're going to have to do some training in the U.S. Not sure, but it doesn't seem like good news that the U.S. is offering to train more Ukrainian pilots. And as I have said, I do wonder if Ukraine would even be able to do anything with only 6 pilots. If, maybe you need 20 or so to really conduct any significant operations and use them in the combined arm tactics that the West has been promoting so much. All right. Next story here. Ukraine claims to land troops on Crimea in night raid. Ukraine's military intelligence claimed on Thursday that Ukrainian troops landed on the western shore of Crimea overnight and inflicted casualties on Russian forces, an operation that has not been confirmed by Russia. During the execution of the task, the Ukrainian defenders engaged in combat with units of the occupier. As a result, the enemy suffered losses among personnel. Enemy equipment was destroyed. Also, the state flag was raised in the Ukrainian Crimea again, and this is a statement from the Ukrainian military intelligence. The HUR Telegram posts where they released this information included videos that showed troops on a small boat in the night. All goals of the task had been completed. At the end of the special operation, the Ukrainian defenders left the scene without casualties. I'm not sure if this is all made up or not. Have no idea. I'm sure Ukraine could produce this as propaganda. I'm sure Ukraine would try to launch an attack on the Crimean Peninsula if they felt that was possible. I'm not quite sure that it is. I'm a little bit skeptical about this. But at the same time, this is the kind of thing that's really going to lead to Russia escalating this war. All right, Zelensky says that elections might happen sometime next year. The Ukrainian president said on Sunday that Ukrainian elections could happen in wartime if Kiev funding from its Western backers, and Ukraine's legislators are willing to hold a vote. Zelensky previously said elections can happen because they are forbidden by Ukrainian's constitution during the martial law time, which has been extended until at least November 15th. Ukraine's next parliamentary elections are scheduled for October, and the next presidential elections are scheduled for March. And so the October elections definitely aren't happening because of the martial law. There's no plans to hold those. I'm not sure if he's saying that maybe in March we would hold presidential elections. Seems kind of unlikely that Zelensky will want to do that, but maybe he has some indication that polling is fairly overwhelmingly pro Zelensky's party here. And look, he's outlawed his political opposition. He has nationalized the media. And so if the people of Ukraine are largely propagandized into supporting Zelensky, wouldn't be a surprise to me. Now, this is in response to Senator Lindsey Graham calling for Ukraine to hold elections in 2024. And I'm guessing that, again, this isn't about any concern about Ukraine's democracy or anything like that. This is just about propaganda, and the U.S. needs Ukraine to look 10% more democratic to help facilitate giving them weapons with less dissent in the U.S. All right, so Russian authorities confirmed that the chief of the Wagner group, Prigozhin, was killed. They said they used DNA. Look, I'm not sure Russia is saying so really convinces me of anything. My instinct is that he is probably dead. He did probably die in this plane crash. However, I for people who are skeptical, there's probably good reason for it. So it's an interesting story, but my guess is either way, Prigozhin's days as head of the Wagner group are over. Maybe he was able to fake this plane crash and flee, or really dupe someone and get on a different plane and get out of town before he was killed or something like that. But I'm guessing his roles as an influence figure in Russia are now over. All right, a couple stories on China here. U.S. Navy commander says China must be challenged to the South China Sea. This is from Vice Admiral Carl Thomas, and they came after incidents between Chinese and Philippine vessels near the disputed reef known as the Second Thomas Shoal. One incident on August 5th involved Chinese boats firing water cannons on Philippine vessels that were trying to resupply a grounded ship near the reef that Melania uses for a base of operations. And what the Philippines did is they beached a ship on a reef. And they say that because this ship is now like a house on that reef, it essentially gives the Philippines control over a large chunk of the South China Sea. Now, Beijing also claims that they own that reef and that gives them control over the South China Sea. And the U.S. bats the Philippines claim for whatever stupid reason, because we feel like we have to, assert our dominance over every corner of the globe. And that certainly includes the waters off of China's coast. And we're going to say that those belong to other countries. And this is going to really stow tensions, not only between China and the Philippines, but between the U.S. and China. Major concern. All right, and we have the Philippines and Australia practicing retaking islands in the South China Sea. And this is the joint military games. We covered these last week. There are 1,200 Australian soldiers. I think there's about 1,200 Philippine soldiers, and only about 600 Philippine Marines, and then 150 Marines, and they are carrying out drills in the South China Sea, retaking islands and things like that. So again, I'm sure this is going to be seen as very provocative by Beijing. It's certainly going to upset, they're going to be upset with Australia and the Philippines over this, but they're also going to see this as a part of the U.S. trying to control the South China Sea and everything that happens there. All right, so last week on the show, I wrote a pretty extensive article about Brits and the summit that was happening. And I mentioned that that group was expanding. And so we have 6 new members. It's Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Argentina, Egypt, and Ethiopia. This to me seems like a very significant group, and for at least 2 reasons. Actually, 3 reasons. The first is in the lead up to the summit with Brits, the Western media was reporting that there was concern, I guess, among South Africa and Brazil that if they agreed to expand to new members, those new members would likely include African and South American countries, and that would diminish Brazil's and South Africa's standing in Brits. Sounded a reasonable thing to say, even if it wasn't true, and it turns out it wasn't. And so, we kind of see with Egypt and Ethiopia being admitted, and then Argentina, that these are major countries in Africa and in South America, and Brazil and South Africa not only affirmed this behind the scenes, but also came out publicly and said that they supported expanding here. And then, of course, we have Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE. Saudi Arabia and the UAE will start there. These are 2 entrenched partners in Washington's empire. They receive a lot of weapons, a lot of support. The 8-year now long war in Yemen waged by these 2 countries has been extensively supported by Washington and has made that war possible. So those 2 countries being willing to join this group that's essentially led by Russia and China. Not that India, Brazil, and South Africa don't have plenty of influence too, but they are the 2 largest and most powerful countries within the bloc, and the U.S. is doing everything they can to isolate them. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE joining would seem to, they're saying that they want to increase their ties with countries that the U.S. is trying to isolate and sanction. And then, of course, Iran. This is one of the main enemies of the American empire. And, of course, I think for Brits, it's a major score to have Iran in. It's a huge country, 80 million people, a large economy, a lot of fuel to export. So there's a lot of reasons why I'm sure Brits is very happy to have Iran, but placing them in another organization with Saudi Arabia and the UAE is, I think, likely to de-escalate tensions in the Middle East. And it's kind of showing that the U.S. doesn't or isn't able to provide stability to regions where other organizations can at least foster it to some extent. All right, this is the article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on Sunday. General Mark Milley, U.S. forces will remain in the Middle East for years to come. America's top general said that Washington plans to maintain its force posture in the Middle East. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, stressed the region's significant importance to Americans' foreign policy. In an interview with Jordanian media on Thursday, Milley said, I can't imagine that the United States will ever walk away from the Middle East. I think we will remain committed for many, many years and decades to come. We have a very close friendships and partnerships, and we will make sure that the region is stable. Obviously, the region is a primary source of oil and energy for other parts of the world. Milley added that the region is very important and very significant to the United States for a lot of reasons. For decades, Washington has used its military in an attempt to control the Middle East. The U.S. has spent trillions of dollars and killed millions of people in dozens of military campaigns conducted over the last 30 years. The wars have failed to accomplish America's stated goals to bring peace, stability, and democracy to the Middle East. Instead, Washington's wars have financed wars and financing of various militaries have stoked sectarian tensions. Additionally, the U.S. has armed a multitude of tyrannical governments, enabling them to brutally oppress their citizens. I left out, of course, that in addition to the militaries that we've armed different militant groups, and these included outright Al-Qaeda-linked jihadist groups. Washington currently has thousands of soldiers in various countries across the region, including hundreds of troops in Syria. Milley said there are still fighters in small groups in and around Syria and around Iraq, and if we were to somehow suddenly withdraw, Islamic State could reconstruct themselves, so the situation is much, much better than it was, but it still requires a level of commitment, so we have to get some amount of forces in Syria, and we've got forces in Iraq. Now, this simply isn't true. Two reasons. One, American troops in Iraq and Syria more often find themselves in conflict with forces supporting the Syrian government, not jihadists, and this includes American warplanes in Syria regularly having near misses with Russian fighter jets over the past couple of months, but additionally, actually how it's playing out right now in Syria, the U.S. is actually getting in the way of the Syrian government, which hates ISIS, which fights ISIS far more intensely and far more often than the Americans. Then it will allow the Syrian government to come in and take back their territory, take full control over Syria, and then squash the ISIS threat. Rather, America is dividing Syria, weakening the Syrian state, preventing the Syrian government from cleaning up the Islamic State in areas that the American government controls, all the while not launching that many raids against the Islamic State forces themselves. So, whatever Milley wants to say and pretend, there's really no reason for the U.S. to get in the Middle East, and if we got out, it'd be much better for everyone involved. All right, U.S. launches airstrikes in Somalia, claims 13 al-Shabaab killed. What a surprise. So AFRICOM, that's the U.S. military command in Africa, said that the strike was launched about 28 miles northwest of the southern port city of Kismayo. The command said that initial assessments found that 13 al-Shabaab fighters were killed and no civilians were harmed. However, the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties, especially in Somalia. And so I have made this point a lot on the show, but it seems to me that essentially every time the U.S. carries out an airstrike in Somalia, they claim, oh my God, we got all these bad ISIS and al-Shabaab fighters. Then if any Western reporter ends up going to the village, everybody in the village goes, no, that airstrike didn't kill al-Shabaab fighters. That airstrike killed innocent civilians. And we know that because 4 of them were old men and 2 of them were children or something along those lines. So again, they always claim to kill al-Shabaab. They always claim to kill ISIS in Somalia, but more often than not, they're just killing civilians. All right, so a quick update on the situation in Niger. Algeria reported on Monday that France is planning a military intervention in Niger if the Nigerian president is not released by the junta that ousted him in the July 26th coup. The radio report cited a government source who said Algeria is opposed to any intervention in Niger over fears it will further destabilize the region and lead to a migrant crisis, as the disastrous U.S. and NATO war in Libya did. And so we have that, and it does seem that war in the Sahel region of Africa is increasingly probable. The U.S. is trying to keep its military presence in Niger, and there's a really good article by Nick Terse called "When a Coup is Not a Coup." And he basically says that the U.S. isn't declaring the situation in Niger to be a coup because they don't want to have to cut off military support and then withdraw their forces from Niger. That they're hoping this will allow them to keep their force posture in the country. And if I were the junta, I would be very concerned about that, because if war breaks out in Niger, I would expect the Americans to eventually start supporting the forces against the junta. And so we had this from Dave DeCamp, August 27th, antiwar.com, last article today. Niger places military on maximum alert over fears of ECOWAS intervention. And ECOWAS is the economic community for West African states. And So there have been talks that this blot that's largely controlled by France and, of course, influenced by Washington, ECOWAS has been planning to invade Niger to return the civilian elected government to power, and the government appears ready to go to war. And this is likely to expand because Burkina Faso and Mali, who are also members of ECOWAS but have been kicked out of the group because they had military coups in their country as well, have said that they'll go to war on behalf of Niger against ECOWAS. So this could turn into a massive regional war. And of course, again, I do think France at least, but likely France and the US will play a role in that war. Maybe I should get somebody on the show to do an in-depth talk about Niger. We did one not a couple of years ago, it might be a couple of years ago now, with Danny Sherjan, who is the great writer and former soldier who did so much work for antiwar.com and a lot of other anti-war outlets on covering the wars in the empire for like 5 years or so there. And really miss being able to talk to Danny now that he's not quite so active. And so without that, I'll have to probably find a new guest to talk to about the situation in West Africa, just to get a little bit more of a breakdown if there is any dissent in ECOWAS and how much of a role France and Washington really do have over all of this. Thank you all so much for tuning into the show. I'll be back with more next week.